In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 3 things you need to know about doing photography in manual mode and why they're important, what they do, and how you can use these things together to make your photography much, much better. First things first, what are the 3 pillars of exposure in manual photography? They are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So we're going to start off with aperture. Now, what is aperture? Aperture is actually really easy to understand because it kind of is like how the pupil in your eye works. When your pupil is smaller, less light is coming in, and when your pupil is larger, that means more light is coming in. It's the same exact thing with an aperture on a lens. So let's take a look at a couple different examples of aperture sizes using this camera right here, the Canon AE1 program, which is a film camera because I'm a hipster. When we're talking about aperture sizes, it's actually referred to as f-stop. So for this lens, the smallest aperture is 1.8. So if we're at f-stop 1.8, this is what it looks like. The lens is wide open and there's nothing constricting any light from coming in. But if we stop this down to say f4, that's what it looks like. So the pupil part of the lens is much smaller and it's letting in a lot less light. If we stop down even more to f8, even less light is coming through. And if we stop down even more all the way to f22, which is the smallest aperture that you can get on this lens, that's how much light is coming through. A very, very minimal amount. So aperture in a camera is responsible for adjusting the amount of light that is coming in and out of a camera based on like a pupil type device inside the lens. But that's not all aperture does. Aperture does something else that's really, really important in photography, and it's something that a lot of people don't understand when they first start taking photos. Aperture not only adjusts the amount of light coming in and out of a lens, it also adjusts the depth of field of focus. Now, what is depth of field when we're talking about focus? Luckily, I have a couple photo examples of some photos that I took at different f-stops, at different aperture settings, and I'll show you the difference in the depth of field of focus. Okay, so if we take a look at this lovely photo of some sort of plant that I saw in my apartment complex, we can see that I took this shot at f1.8 right over here in the settings tab. Now f1.8 is the widest that you can get on this specific lens I was using, and let's take a look at the photo. What we can see is the subject, which I believe is this branch of some sort of plant right here. If we zoom in right here, we've got a lot of detail on the plant itself. It's really nice and sharp, as well as some other plants that were in the general vicinity, about the same distance from the lens, are in focus as well. But the background is completely washed out. It's really blurry, and there's a good separation between the subject, which are these little plant things right here, and the background. But what happens if we take our aperture and we close it off to something like f16? Bam! Way different look. Now, I want you to notice the lighting is exactly the same in both of these photos. I mean, if anything, the f16 photo is slightly darker, but the exposure levels are right about the same. But the biggest difference is all that background that was washed out is now pretty in focus. I mean, it's still blurry, but you can definitely tell what's going on, and there's much less separation between the subject and the background of the photo. So that is something that is really important when you're dealing with different aperture settings. That's why in nature photography, you see a lot of landscape photos in which like the trees that are just 100 meters away are all in focus, as well as the mountains that are like half a mile away. It's all in focus. That's because they're using a really closed off aperture to be able to have a really long depth of field of focus. So that's what aperture does. It controls the light coming into the camera with like a pupil type device, and it controls the amount of depth of field of focus that you have when you're taking a picture. So we're going to move on now to shutter speed. So shutter is the device that moves in front of the sensor of the camera that blocks light and then lets light in and lets the light hit the sensor. So a shutter speed is going to be the speed in which the shutter moves in front of the sensor to allow light to hit it. I'm going to show you a couple examples on actually a different hipster camera, which is my Yashica FX3. I'm going to show you a couple different examples of shutter speed on here. So, because this is a film camera, I can open up the back of this and show you exactly what the shutter is doing as it's doing it, which is what I'm going to try to do right now. Hopefully this is in focus because I'm using my A7R2 to record this and I don't have a screen that I can look at, so I don't really know what's in focus, but hopefully you can see this. So, this first shot right here, shot at 1/1000th of a second. That's 1/1000th of a second it's going to take to roll the shutter through. This is what it looks like at 1/1000th of a second. That was really, really fast. And in fact, it was 1/1000th of a second. That's how fast it was. But let's move it down to something like, say, 125th of a second. This is the speed at 1/125th. I'll show you that again. Still really fast, but not as fast as it was before because you can actually see it moving through here. I'm going to do that one again one more time. That was at 1/125th of a second. Now let's go even slower. Let's bring this one all the way down to 1/4 of a second, and let's see how fast the shutter moves through here. Yeah, a lot slower, a lot more light's being let in when you're at 1/4 of a second. Now, why is it important to understand shutter speeds in a camera? Well, first of all, when you're taking a picture of something and you want that picture to be a moment that is frozen in time, you're going to want a faster shutter speed. When you have a lower shutter speed, anything that's moving in front of the camera is going to risk having some sort of motion blur. And I've got a couple examples of that I'm going to show you right now. So, the first photo we're going to take a look at is a photo of my wife. This is not a particularly interesting photo, so I do apologize, but what I had her do was walk from one side of the camera to the other side of the camera, and at a couple different shutter speeds, I took a photo of her as she was walking. So this first shot was shot at 1/250th of a second, which is actually really not that fast, and I should have taken this at a little bit faster, and this is why. When we zoom in on her, we can see a very small amount of blur. Majority of that blur is actually because she's a little bit out of focus, and I wasn't really trying super hard to make her really tack sharp in this photo. You can see a little bit of blur on the hair and a little bit of blur just kind of like in general. But generally speaking, when we're zooming in on her pants are in focus, we can see her shoelaces right here. There's nothing that's like really showing a lot of motion blur in this photo. But I did slow the shutter quite a bit down on this next photo, down to 1/50th of a second. And when we zoom in right here, we can actually see that there is quite a bit of motion blur in here, and actually the only part of her that's not completely blurry is her leg that's currently standing right here. The rest of her is just one big blur, and you can definitely tell that she's moving. And now when we slow that down even more to 1/13th of a second, she essentially just becomes a ghost. She becomes a one-legged ghost in this photo because she's moving, and the shutter was open for so long that a lot of light came through and it was able to capture her moving quite a bit. There are situations where you might want a slower shutter speed, and those situations could be at night when you're taking pictures of the sky. You need to let in a lot more light when you're taking photos at night, and when you're taking photos of the sky, you're going to need to let your shutter open for quite a bit longer. So we're good on aperture, we're good on shutter speed. Now we need to talk about something that's very important, which is ISO. ISO stands for International Standard Organization, which does not help you understand what ISO is whatsoever. So I'm going to break this down in a really, really simple way. ISO is essentially like camera-generated light. It's light that doesn't exist in the photo based on the shutter speed and the aperture that you have it set at. So when you don't have enough light in a photo and you can't adjust those two things, you'll bump up your ISO to adjust for that, and you're going to bring your exposure levels to appropriate amounts. Now, that sounds really great. It sounds like it's just like a magical tool to use in photography to add more light when you need more light. So you could shoot in the middle of the night and not have any problems, but that's not true at all, and here's why. If you can take a photo with the appropriate shutter speed and the appropriate aperture that you need for your photo, and you can keep your ISO down to 100, that's exactly what you want to be shooting for. But it's not a problem to bring it up unless you bring it up too much, and this is why. At ISO 100, everything in here looks pretty sharp. The background is really nice and smooth. It almost looks like a painting, and I don't really see any sort of blur or any issues with this photo. But if I move over to this photo right here that was shot at ISO 400, the lighting looks the same. It looks like almost the exact same picture, just kind of taken at a different point in time. But if we zoom in on the photo, now we're seeing that even though everything's still in focus, it's got this like weird, like grainy texture on it, almost like there's sand on the photo. Well, that's ISO. When you bring too much ISO into a photo, the background of your photo and your photo in general is going to be more noisy, and it's going to have a lot more grain in it. I did, against my better judgment, take another photo at the maxed out ISO level on my Sony a7R II, which is much higher than most cameras go to, so chances are you're not going to be able to go this high, but let's take a look at the photo anyways. So this photo is of an 8-ball on a pool table. ISO is set at 100. If we zoom in on the 8-ball, it's nice and sharp. You can see little nicks from people hitting it, and you can see the light bouncing off of it. It's an okay photo. It's ISO 100, like I said before. But this photo right here, that I really don't want to click on because it's going to make me uncomfortable, was shot at ISO 102,400. So ISO 102400. And immediately we can tell that this photo it's got some problems with it. If we zoom in on here, this really looks like a damaged film photo. This has got so much grain in it and so much noise in it. This does not look good at all. Now, that doesn't mean that grain in photos doesn't look good. It doesn't mean that noise in photos is necessarily a bad thing unless it's something that you want to have in your photo. But if you're not paying attention to your ISO levels because you don't understand what ISO does, you can run into an issue where you take a photo with a really expensive, nice digital camera, and it comes out looking like a $20 film camera, and you might not want that look, especially if it wasn't done on purpose. So make sure that you're keeping your ISO at acceptable levels. I can't tell you what the magic number of ISO is. It's going to vary between the cameras, but what I can tell you is if you play around with it enough with the camera that you use, you'll be able to find the sweet spot, the zone where you don't want to go above too high on your camera. Just stick with that. You can bump it up a little bit more if you need to, but don't bring it into 100 and 2000 because you're going to get a lot of grain in there. So if you apply these three things, these pillars of exposure, these three things that create the triangle of light or the trifecta of photography greatness in manual mode, your photos are going to be better. Your portraits will separate the model from the background and they'll be properly exposed. Your landscape photos will have everything in focus and a really long depth of field of focus, which will be really great. And your photos won't come out grainy because you bumped the ISO up way too high or left it on auto on accident. Thanks for watching the video. Let me know what you think about it. Share it with your relatives and friends and family and coworkers and your boss and other people. I do want to leave you with this though. I challenge you to take your camera out, switch it over to manual settings and shoot like that for a week straight and just see what changes. You might find that your photos are going to have a little bit more and they're going to pop a little bit better. Thanks for watching again and have a good night or day whenever you end up watching this. Whatever time it is, enjoy the rest of that time.